The chill of November settled over Hollow Street, a quiet suburban neighborhood in Portland, Oregon. Liam Garrett adjusted his camera strap as he stepped out of his car, scanning the row of neatly lined houses. The tip he received had intrigued him, a string of break-ins, always accompanied by a clown sighting. It sounded ridiculous, and Liam almost didn't bother. But something about the way the caller described it, the fear in their voice, made him pause. He had always been skeptical of anything supernatural, but the pattern was too strange to ignore. "It's probably just a prank," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. He turned to see Emily, his younger sister, waving at him from the front porch of their parents' house. She was smiling, her warm demeanor a sharp contrast to Liam's skepticism. Emily had recently moved back home after finishing her nursing degree, and her trusting nature often grated against Liam's own suspicious tendencies. "Are you seriously here for that clown story?" she called out, her tone teasing. "Liam, it's just some kids playing dress-up. Hollow Street is fine." Liam shrugged, trying to suppress the uneasy feeling that had lodged itself in his chest. "I don't know, Em. There's just something off about this," he replied, his gaze drifting toward the house where the latest incident had occurred. It belonged to an elderly couple, and the thought of someone terrorizing them made his stomach churn. As he approached the house, he noticed the small details that others might overlook: scratches on the windowsill, faint muddy footprints leading away from the back door. He knelt down, running his fingers over the marks. "These aren't random," he murmured, taking out his camera to snap a few photos. Emily rolled her eyes from a distance, her arms crossed. "You're being paranoid again," she said, though her voice carried a hint of worry. Liam sighed, knowing she thought he was overreacting. Ever since that incident in their childhood, a prank that went wrong, leaving Liam with anxiety that had never truly faded, he'd been hyper-aware of anything out of the ordinary. Emily had always been there to pull him back from the edge, to remind him not everything was a threat. But Hollow Street didn't feel safe anymore, and that scared him more than he was willing to admit. Later that day, Liam met up with Ethan Bell, his best friend and a private investigator. Ethan had a rugged look, unshaven, tired eyes, his demeanor hardened by years of chasing leads that often led to dead ends. He had once been a cop, but a botched case had cost him his career. Now, the need for redemption drove him, and when Liam mentioned the clown, Ethan hesitated before agreeing to help. "I don't know, man," Ethan muttered, his voice low. "Sounds like a prank, but if you're serious, let's check it out." Their investigation led them to an abandoned playground, a place once filled with laughter, now overtaken by rust and decay. The swings creaked in the wind, and the slide was covered in graffiti. Liam felt a chill as they moved through the playground, his flashlight casting long shadows. Ethan was the first to notice the broken clown masks, pieces scattered among the leaves, their hollow eyes staring up at them. "This is getting weird," Ethan said, his voice tense. They found a note pinned to a tree, written in crude red letters: "Leave or else." Liam's anxiety peaked, his hands trembling as he read the words aloud. Ethan clenched his jaw, his eyes scanning the darkness around them. "We're not alone," he said, his voice barely a whisper. They left the playground, but the sense of unease followed them home. The tension between Liam and Emily grew in the following days. She dismissed his fears, insisting that their neighbors were good people, that no one would do something so malicious. But Liam couldn't let it go. He stayed up late, watching from his window, his eyes scanning the street for any sign of movement. It was during one of these nights that he saw it, a figure in a clown costume standing at the edge of their yard, its head cocked to the side as if watching him. Liam's heart pounded in his chest, his breath caught in his throat. He grabbed his camera, but by the time he looked back, the figure was gone. He told Ethan the next day, his voice shaking as he recounted what he had seen. Ethan frowned, the lines on his face deepening. "We need to get ahead of this," he said, determination in his voice. But Liam could see the doubt in his eyes, the uncertainty that lingered from his past failure. Ethan was struggling, and Liam knew it. But they couldn't stop now. Their search for answers led them deeper into the neighborhood's secrets. They spoke to neighbors, many of whom were reluctant to talk. Some were visibly frightened, their eyes darting around as if the clown might appear at any moment. It was clear that the break-ins were more than just random acts. There was something deliberate, something personal about them. The turning point came when Ethan's past resurfaced. They were at a diner, questioning a witness when one of Ethan's old colleagues approached them. "Still chasing ghosts, Belle?" The man sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. Ethan tensed, his fists clenching under the table. The reminder of his past failure stung, and Liam could see the fire ignite in his friend's eyes. After that, Ethan became more aggressive in his pursuit, driven by a need to prove himself, to Liam, to the neighborhood, to himself. But the clown wasn't done. The attacks escalated, and soon, Liam and Emily's home became the target. They found notes left on their doorstep, cryptic, taunting messages that pushed Liam's paranoia to the brink. He could barely sleep, his mind racing with possibilities. Emily, ever the peacemaker, tried to reason with the unknown figure, leaving a note of her own asking them to stop, to leave them alone. It was a mistake. That night, Liam woke to the sound of glass shattering. He rushed downstairs to find Emily standing in the living room, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. The clown stood outside, its silhouette framed in the broken window. Ethan arrived moments later, his gun drawn, his face set in determination. He chased the clown into the night, Liam following close behind. The pursuit led them to an old abandoned house at the edge of the neighborhood, a place that had long been forgotten. Inside, the walls were covered in newspaper clippings, photos of Liam, Emily, and Ethan. It was personal. The realization hit Liam like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a random series of break-ins. This was about them. The climax was a blur of chaos. Ethan confronted the clown, and in the struggle, the mask was torn away, revealing a face from Ethan's past, a man he had once failed to protect, now seeking revenge. The look in the man's eyes was one of pure hatred, and Liam felt the ground shift beneath him. His paranoia had been justified, but the cost was more than he could bear. When it was over, the clown was gone, but the damage remained. The neighborhood was no longer the safe place it had once been. Liam's hands still shook, the fear lingering like a shadow that wouldn't leave. Emily tried to comfort him, but the distance between them had grown, a chasm carved by the events of the past weeks. Ethan, though victorious, seemed more broken than ever, the weight of his past failures now compounded by the scars of their encounter. The Clown of Hollow Street became another story whispered among the residents, a cautionary tale of trust, fear, and the darkness that can hide behind a painted smile. And though the clown was gone, Liam knew that the fear would never truly leave him. Hollow Street had changed, and so had he, forever marked by the face behind the mask and the chilling laughter that haunted his dreams. Story 2. October 2017 in Lincoln, Nebraska brought a chill that settled deep into the bones. Nina Harper pulled her sweater tight around her as she crossed the empty street, the streetlights flickering above her. The town was quiet, too quiet, with only the rustle of leaves breaking the silence. It was the kind of place where secrets festered, where the past never quite let go. She had always been fascinated by the urban legends that surrounded Lincoln, especially the one about the Lincoln Clown. Every Halloween, stories would surface of strange laughter heard at midnight, a clown spotted lingering near dark alleys, and people disappearing, only to reappear with no memory of where they had been. As a librarian and lover of true crime stories, Nina couldn't help but be intrigued. She glanced over her shoulder as she approached the old theater, a relic from a time when the town still bustled with life. The building loomed over her, its once grand facade now cracked and worn. Jake Thompson, her childhood friend, stood by the entrance, his face illuminated by the dull glow of his flashlight. He gave her a half-smile, the kind that tried to hide his worry. Jake had always been the protector, and Nina knew he hated the idea of her getting involved in something like this. But he was here anyway, for her. "You ready for this?" Jake asked, his voice barely audible over the wind. Nina nodded, though her heart was pounding. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. Together they pushed open the heavy theater doors, the creak echoing into the empty space beyond. They weren't alone. Maya Carter, the new girl in town, was waiting inside. She was seated on one of the dusty theater seats, her sketchbook open on her lap. Maya was different, quiet, mysterious, with a fascination for the eerie that drew her to dark places like this. She looked up as they entered, her eyes narrowing slightly before she smiled. "Thought you two would never make it," she teased, her voice soft but with an edge of excitement. Nina forced a smile, her unease growing. There was something about Maya that put her on edge, but she couldn't deny that the girl knew her stuff. Maya had read more about the Lincoln Clown than anyone else, her sketches capturing the dark imagery of the legend in a way that was both beautiful and unsettling. The theater was everything they expected. Dark, eerie, with graffiti scrawled across the walls and old props scattered across the floor. The air was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked under their weight. They moved cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating old posters and shattered glass. It was Maya who found it first, a mural painted on one of the back walls, a crude but chilling depiction of a clown, its wide, toothy grin stretched across its face. Beneath it, the words, "Laugh with me," were painted in red, the letters smeared as if done in haste. "Creepy," Jake muttered, his eyes darting around as if expecting something to jump out at them. Nina shivered, her imagination running wild. The theater felt alive, like it was watching them, waiting for something. She glanced at Maya, who was busy sketching the mural, her eyes focused, her expression almost serene. "Maya, how can you be so calm?" Nina asked, her voice trembling slightly. Maya looked up, her eyes meeting Nina's. "Because it's just a story," she said, though there was something in her voice that hinted she didn't fully believe that. Their investigation wasn't without its setbacks. The next day, as they spoke to some of the locals, they were met with hostility. People didn't like outsiders digging into the town's dark history, and Lincoln was no exception. A man at the diner warned them to stop, his voice low and threatening. "Some things are better left alone," he said, his eyes hard as he glared at them. Jake bristled at the man's tone, his protective side coming out. "We're just trying to understand," he shot back, his hand clenching into a fist. Nina placed a hand on his arm, trying to calm him. "Jake, it's okay," she whispered, but the tension between them was palpable. Jake had always blamed himself for not being able to protect those he cared about, and this investigation was bringing all those insecurities to the surface. Maya, meanwhile, revealed a part of her past that neither Nina nor Jake had expected. One night, as they sat in Nina's living room, Maya opened up about the tragedy that had brought her to Lincoln. Her family had been haunted by clowns, literally. A party gone wrong, a clown that was more than it seemed, and the aftermath that left her family broken. It was why she was so obsessed, why she had to see this through. Her voice cracked as she spoke, her usually composed demeanor faltering. Nina felt her heart break for Maya, realizing that this wasn't just a legend for her. It was personal. The clown's presence became more tangible as the days went on. They began to hear the laughter, soft, echoing through the streets at midnight. It was subtle at first, almost like a trick of the wind. But then it grew louder, more distinct, as if it was coming from just outside their doors. Nina's fear of being alone, something she had always struggled with, began to overwhelm her. She found herself calling Jake late at night, her voice trembling as she asked if he could come over. Jake never hesitated, his need to protect her overpowering his own fear. Maya, too, seemed affected, her usually calm demeanor cracking as the laughter grew more frequent, more mocking. It all came to a head at the edge of town, near an old decrepit bridge. They had followed the laughter there, the sound leading them like a beacon. The moon was full, casting long shadows across the deserted road. Nina's heart pounded as they approached, her flashlight flickering. The laughter echoed around them, seeming to come from everywhere at once. Then they saw him, the clown. He stood at the edge of the bridge, his clothes tattered, his face painted in a grotesque smile. But his eyes were filled with pain, with rage. He wasn't just a monster, he was a man, broken by loss and driven to madness. Jake stepped forward, his protective instincts kicking in. "Stay back," he growled, his voice steady, though Nina could see his hands trembling. The clown tilted his head, his laughter dying down to a soft chuckle. "You think you can stop me?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. Jake lunged and they struggled, the two figures a blur of motion. Nina watched, frozen, as Jake fought to protect them, his vulnerabilities laid bare. He wasn't a hero. He was just a man, scared and desperate to keep those he loved safe. In the end, it was Maya who stepped forward, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Stop!" she screamed, her eyes locked on the clown's. He paused, his grip on Jake loosening. "I know you," Maya said, her voice shaking. "I know what happened to you." She spoke of his past, of the life he had lost, the family taken from him, the grief that had twisted him into what he had become. The clown's expression shifted, the rage fading, replaced by something else, something almost human. He let go of Jake, stepping back, his eyes wide with recognition. The clown disappeared into the night, leaving them standing by the bridge, the laughter echoing faintly as he vanished. The authorities found them hours later, shaken but alive. The story spread quickly, a tragic tale of a man broken by grief, haunting the town that had taken everything from him. Lincoln was free from the immediate threat, but the scars remained. Nina found herself alone in her apartment the following night, the silence almost unbearable. But something had changed. She wasn't as scared as she had been. She had faced the darkness, seen the pain behind the painted smile, and though the fear was still there, it no longer controlled her. Jake visited her often, the bond between them stronger than ever, forged in the fear and chaos they had faced together. Maya, too, became a part of their lives, her art now filled with the hope that had been missing before. The legend of the Lincoln Clown became another story whispered among the townspeople, a reminder of the darkness that could consume a person, and the laughter that still echoed on cold October nights. And though Nina still heard it sometimes, that soft, mocking laughter, she no longer hid from it. She faced it, her flashlight in hand, ready to confront whatever shadows lingered in the night. Story 3. December 2016 in Salem, Massachusetts, brought with it a biting cold and a sense of unease that seemed to linger in the air. Oliver Grayson, a 32-year-old history teacher, walked along the cobblestone streets, his eyes scanning the aged buildings that stood as a testament to Salem's haunted past. The town's history fascinated him: witch trials, injustices, lost lives. All of it resonated with the part of him that feared losing control. Salem was a reminder of how quickly things could spiral out of control, and yet Oliver found himself drawn to its dark past, like a moth to a flame. Beside him, Lucy Bennett, his fiancée, kept her hands stuffed into her coat pockets, her breath visible in the cold December air. Lucy worked as a tour guide at the Salem Witch Museum, and though she loved history, she was much more pragmatic about it than Oliver. She believed that the past should be remembered, but not obsessed over. Oliver's recent fixation with the clown sightings in Salem was starting to wear on her. It wasn't like him to be so consumed by something so speculative, so disconnected from the rational world she cherished. "Are you really going to keep chasing this clown story?" Lucy asked, her tone soft but carrying an edge of frustration. Oliver glanced at her, his eyes slightly glassy, a sign that he had been lost in his thoughts again. He smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I just want to know if there's anything to it," he replied. "It's not just a story, Lucy. There are symbols. There's a pattern. It means something." Lucy sighed, shaking her head. She loved Oliver deeply, but his need to find meaning in everything, to make sense of chaos, was exhausting. She hoped this obsession would pass, that he would tire of it once they found nothing substantial. Oliver wasn't alone in his pursuit. He had enlisted the help of Daniel Moore, a 35-year-old paranormal investigator. Daniel had been in the industry for years, but recent experiences had left him disillusioned. He had seen too many hoaxes, too many people exploiting fear for profit. When Oliver approached him, Daniel had hesitated, but something in Oliver's conviction struck a chord. He agreed to help, though he had made it clear that he didn't expect to find anything real. The three of them found themselves at an old cemetery, one of the many scattered throughout Salem. The sun had long since set, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting eerie shadows across the headstones. The wind whistled through the bare branches, and Oliver's flashlight flickered as they made their way deeper into the graveyard. Daniel walked ahead, his equipment strapped to his back, his expression one of mild disinterest. Lucy stayed close to Oliver, her eyes darting around nervously. She didn't like this, being out here in the cold, chasing shadows, but she stayed because Oliver needed her, even if he wouldn't admit it. "Look at this," Daniel called out, his voice echoing slightly in the stillness. Oliver hurried over, his heart pounding in his chest. Daniel was pointing at a series of symbols etched into an old headstone, strange looping marks that seemed to glow under the moonlight. Oliver knelt down, his fingers tracing the lines. "These are just like the ones I read about," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. Lucy shivered, wrapping her coat tighter around herself. "Oliver, we should go. This is getting out of hand," she said, her voice tinged with worry. But Oliver didn't move. He was captivated, his eyes fixed on the symbols. Daniel watched him, his skepticism wavering. There was something about the symbols, something that felt different from the usual nonsense he encountered. He took out his camera, snapping a few photos. "All right, but let's not stay too long," Daniel said, his tone begrudgingly respectful of Oliver's enthusiasm. As the night wore on, the tension between Oliver and Lucy grew. She was tired, cold, and frustrated with his inability to let things go. "Why does this matter so much to you?" she finally asked, her voice breaking the silence. Oliver looked at her, his eyes wide, almost desperate. "Because it's part of history, Lucy. It's part of this place, and it's connected to everything that happened here. The trials, the deaths. It all left a mark, and I need to understand it." Lucy shook her head, her eyes glistening with tears she refused to let fall. "Not everything needs to be understood, Oliver. Some things just are." Her words hung in the air, a painful truth that Oliver struggled to accept. Their search continued over the next few days, taking them to different parts of Salem, places known for their haunted histories, places tourists avoided after dark. Daniel's disillusionment grew as they encountered people exploiting the legend of the Salem clown for profit. One local historian had even set up a small tour, charging tourists to visit the supposed haunts of the clown. Daniel felt his stomach churn as he watched the man weave lies into the story, turning pain into a spectacle. "This is why I hate this business," Daniel muttered, his voice laced with disgust. Despite the setbacks, the clown's presence became undeniable. They began to find artifacts, old, worn shoes, pieces of tattered clothing, and messages scrawled in chalk on the walls of alleys. Each message seemed to be a taunt, a reminder that they were being watched. "The past lives on," one message read, the words looping and uneven. Oliver's fear of losing control began to surface, his obsession deepening as the evidence piled up. He spent hours poring over old maps and journals, trying to piece together the connections, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. The climax of their investigation came at a historical site, a house once owned by one of the judges from the Salem witch trials. They had followed a trail of symbols there, each one leading them closer to the truth. The house loomed over them, its windows dark, its walls worn with age. Oliver pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. The air inside was cold, and the floorboards creaked beneath their feet as they stepped inside. In the dim light, they saw him, the clown. He stood in the corner of the room, his face painted in grotesque colors, his eyes dark and hollow. But there was something else there, something beyond the paint. Oliver took a step forward, his breath caught in his throat. "Who are you?" he whispered. The clown tilted his head, a sad smile tugging at his lips. "I am what they made me," he replied, his voice barely audible. It was then that they understood. He was a descendant of one of the families wrongly accused during the witch trials, a family that had lost everything because of the hysteria, because of the fear. He had lived his whole life in the shadow of that pain, that loss, and it had twisted him into something unrecognizable. He wasn't a monster, he was a victim, just like those who had come before him. Daniel's skepticism shattered in that moment. He had always believed that ghosts were just stories, that people used them to explain the unexplainable. But now, faced with the reality of what they had found, he felt something shift inside him. The clown's laughter was soft, almost a whisper, as he stepped back into the shadows, disappearing as if he had never been there at all. The authorities found them the next morning, shaken but unharmed. The story spread quickly, another tale to add to Salem's haunted history, another reminder of the injustices that had been done in the name of fear. Oliver and Lucy's relationship was strained but intact, the experience leaving scars that would take time to heal. Lucy knew that Oliver would never stop searching for answers, but she hoped that he had learned something about the dangers of obsession, about the importance of letting go. As for Daniel, he left Salem with a newfound respect for the unknown. He had spent years debunking myths, exposing frauds, but now he understood that not everything could be explained. Some things were meant to remain in the shadows, their laughter echoing softly on the coldest winter nights. The legend of the Salem Clown became another ghost story told by locals, a tragic figure, born from the injustices of the past, his laughter a reminder of the darkness that still lingered in the corners of Salem. And though Oliver still felt the pull of the town's haunted history, he knew that some mysteries were better left unsolved, their answers lost to time and shadows. Story 4. August 2015 brought the sticky heat of summer to Camden, New Jersey, and with it came the annual carnival. The air was filled with the scent of cotton candy and fried food, mingling with the sounds of laughter, shrill screams of joy, and the steady mechanical hum of the rides. Sofia Rivera stood near the entrance, her eyes scanning the crowds. The flashing lights, the swirling colors, and the cacophony of noise all mixed together to form an overwhelming scene. She gripped her phone, her knuckles pale. Her cousin Marco was supposed to meet her here 20 minutes ago, and his lateness was doing nothing to ease her anxiety. Sofia had always been fascinated by the human mind, how fear worked, what made people tick, which was why she had pursued psychology. But she had her own fears to contend with. Crowds, confined spaces, and above all, clowns. This carnival, with its larger-than-life atmosphere, was a breeding ground for all of those things. But it also provided the perfect opportunity to explore fear up close. Marco had convinced her to come, promising they would document the darker side of the carnival for one of his amateur films. He said it would be fun. Sofia had her doubts. "Soph, over here!" Marco's voice rang out over the din, and she turned to see him jogging towards her, his camera bag bouncing against his side. He wore a wide grin, his eyes bright with excitement. Marco had always been the brave one, the thrill-seeker of the family. He thrived on adrenaline, and his carefree demeanor often masked the fact that he had no clear direction in life. It was part of why he threw himself into projects like this. He was always searching for something that made him feel alive, that gave him purpose. "You're late," Sofia muttered, though she couldn't help but smile as he approached. Marco gave her a playful shrug. Yeah, but check this out." He pulled out his camera, showing her the footage he had already captured. The shots were shaky, the colors vivid, the carnival's neon lights blurring into streaks of color. "This place is perfect. It's got all the creepy vibes we need," he said, his voice filled with enthusiasm. Sofia nodded, her unease lingering. She couldn't shake the feeling that something about this carnival was off. They made their way through the throngs of people, Marco filming everything, the rides, the game booths, the performers. Sophia's eyes kept darting to the shadows between the tents, half expecting to see something lurking there. The legend of the Camden Clown had been a whispered story for as long as she could remember. People said the clown haunted the carnival, that every few years someone would disappear, and the only clue left behind would be a red balloon or a scrap of clown fabric. Sophia tried to tell herself it was just a story, but there was something about the way people spoke about it, the hushed tones, the averted gazes, that made it feel all too real. It was near the Ferris wheel that they met Elena Vasquez. She was working the ticket booth, her dark eyes tired but kind. Marco, always eager to strike up a conversation, asked her about the legend. Elena hesitated, her gaze flickering to Sophia, then back to Marco. "You really want to know about the Camden Clown?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the blaring music and laughter. Marco nodded eagerly, and Elena sighed. "There are things people don't talk about. Accidents, disappearances, it's all tied to this place. You should be careful." Her words sent a shiver down Sophia's spine, and she noticed the way Elena's hand trembled slightly as she handed them their tickets. As the night wore on, strange things began to happen. The laughter that echoed through the carnival seemed to change, becoming deeper, more sinister. At one point, they walked by a row of game booths, only to find them deserted, the prizes swaying gently in the breeze. Marco was unfazed, filming it all, but Sophia's unease grew. She felt as if they were being watched, as if something was following them, lurking just out of sight. She glanced back over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the shadows, but saw nothing. Still, the feeling persisted. "You're just psyching yourself out," she muttered under her breath, trying to focus on Marco's excitement. He had dragged her to the edge of the carnival, where the lights were dimmer and fewer people wandered. Elena had warned them not to go too far, but Marco was insistent. "This is where the real stuff happens," he had said, his grin widening. Sophia wished she shared his confidence. Suddenly, a burst of movement caught Sophia's eye. A flash of red darting between two tents. Her heart leapt into her throat, and she grabbed Marco's arm. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice shaky. Marco turned, his camera ready, but the figure was gone. "Probably just one of the performers," he said, though even his voice held a hint of doubt. They continued on, but the air felt heavier, the oppressive sense of being followed, never quite leaving them. Later that night, they found Elena again, her shift over. She stood by the carousel, her eyes scanning the crowds, her expression tense. When she saw them, she walked over, her movements hurried. "You need to leave," she said, her voice urgent. "This place, it's not safe tonight." Sophia exchanged a glance with Marco, who looked more intrigued than frightened. "What do you mean?" he asked, but Elena shook her head. "Just go, trust me." There was something in her eyes, a depth of fear that Sophia couldn't ignore. But Marco, ever the thrill-seeker, refused to leave without answers. He convinced Elena to talk, and reluctantly, she agreed. They sat by one of the deserted food stands, Elena's hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. She spoke in a low voice, her gaze distant. "There was an accident here years ago. A worker. He was part of the clown act. Something went wrong and he didn't make it. They said it was just a freak accident, but some of us know better. He's still here, angry, looking for someone to blame." Sophia felt her skin prickle with fear. The pieces began to fall into place. The strange laughter, the shadows, the unease that seemed to seep through the carnival grounds. "Why stay here if you know all this?" Sophia asked, her voice barely a whisper. Elena looked at her, her eyes filled with a sadness that made Sophia's chest tighten. "I owe him. I was there when it happened. I couldn't save him." The words hung in the air, heavy and full of regret. The final confrontation came at the edge of the carnival grounds near the old funhouse. They had heard the laughter again, louder this time, echoing through the empty pathways. Marco had his camera out, determined to capture whatever was happening. The funhouse loomed before them, its paint chipped, its entrance dark and foreboding. Sophia's heart pounded as they approached, her breath catching in her throat. She could see the faint outline of a figure just inside, a clown, its face painted in grotesque colors, its eyes fixed on them. Marco stepped forward, his camera rolling, but the clown moved faster. In an instant it was upon them, its laughter deafening, its eyes filled with rage. Marco stumbled back, his bravado crumbling as fear took hold. Sophia felt her own fear threaten to paralyze her, but then she saw Elena, her face set with determination. "Stop!" Elena shouted, stepping between them and the clown. "I know who you are! I know what happened! It wasn't your fault!" The clown paused, its laughter fading into a low, pained moan. For a moment, the rage seemed to drain from its eyes, replaced by something softer, something broken. Elena took a step closer, her voice gentle. "You don't have to do this. Let it go." The clown stared at her, its painted smile drooping, and then slowly, it stepped back, disappearing into the shadows of the funhouse. The carnival continued on, the music blaring, the ride spinning, as if nothing had happened. But for Sophia, Marco, and Elena, everything had changed. They stood there, the weight of what they had witnessed settling over them. Marco's camera hung limply at his side, the footage he had captured a reminder of how close they had come to something far darker than they had imagined. The Camden Carnival carried on, but the legend of the Camden Clown grew. People whispered of the strange events that had taken place, of the worker who still haunted the grounds, seeking justice for a wrong that had never been righted. Sophia found herself changed by the experience. She had faced her fears, confronted the darkness that had always lurked at the edges of her mind. And though the memories of that night lingered, haunting her dreams, she knew she was stronger for it. Elena stayed with the carnival, her debt unpaid, her connection to the past unbroken. Marco, for once, seemed subdued, his usual bravado tempered by what they had seen. He still filmed, still chased the thrill, but there was a caution to him now, a recognition of the boundaries they had almost crossed. The carnival's curse in Camden became another chapter in the town's long history of eerie tales, a reminder that the past, no matter how deeply buried, could always resurface, bringing with it the laughter of those who had been wronged and the shadows of those who could not move on.